Welcome to Chapter 34. We're going to be discussing in the next several segments the origin and evolution of vertebrates. However, we're going to start with chordates. So this segment is focused on chordates. It's important to note that chordates are not actually vertebrates. So the evolution of vertebrates began with the chordates. So if we take a look at this tree right here, we have the chordates, and remember chapter 33 discussed the echinodermata, and this is really a tree of all representing all deuterostomes. Now, we've already discussed the echinodermata, and now we're going to move into the chordates, and the chordates that are not vertebrates include the cephalochordata and the urochordata. And it's important to note that one of their key characteristics is the presence of a notochord that's present sometime during their development. However, there are three other characteristics that make up key characteristics that make up the chordates. And then, of course, the vertebrates are a group of animals that have vertebrae. So it's important to note that the chordates do not have vertebrae. So if we move on, the chordates, like I mentioned, they all have a notochord. They also have what's called a dorsal hollow nerve cord, along with a couple extra other characteristics. So the phylum Chordata consists of those two basal groups, which I showed you in the tree. And then it also includes the vertebrates. However, the two basal groups are not vertebrates. Now, this phylum includes animals that are all bilaterally symmetrical. They are also coelomate, so they have a true body cavity, and they all have segmented bodies. The chordates, again, phylum Chordata, include the two groups of invertebrates, or the basal groups, the urochordata and the cephalochordata, and then it also includes all of vertebrates. But again, the urochordata and the cephalochordata are not vertebrates because they have no vertebrae. Now, the four characteristics of chordates, or all chordates are the following. So there is the notochord, as previously mentioned, the dorsal hollow nerve cord, the post-anal tail, and the presence of pharyngeal slits or clefts. Some of these species have these traits only during embryonic development. Some of them retain the traits throughout their development until they're adults. But all chordates share these traits at some point during their development. So the notochord is actually a long longitudinal rod. It's kind of a flexible rod, and it is present between the dorsal hollow nerve cord and the digestive system. The notochord provides skeletal support. In most vertebrates, however, a more complex skeleton forms, which would make up the vertebrae. Adults retain only remnants of the notochord in the vertebrate group. The nerve cord in the embryo develops from the ectoderm, and it rolls to form a tube called the dorsal hollow nerve cord. Okay, so again, this is dorsal to the notochord, and that's why the term dorsal is used to describe the hollow nerve cord. This eventually develops into the central nervous system, which includes the brain and the spinal cord. In most chordates, the grooves in the pharynx are called the pharyngeal clefts. These are going to develop into slits that open up to the outside of the body, really forming the gills in some species. So those species that are suspension feeding, and these are going to be the suspension feeding structures in the invertebrates, which includes the process of gas exchange in vertebrates. Now, this does not occur in the tetrapods. The tetrapods develop, these pharyngeal clefts develop into parts of the ear, parts of the neck, and parts of the head. The chordates also have a posterior, tail, which is called the post-anal tail. This is often reduced during embryonic development. However, it is retained in some chordates. This contains skeletal elements and muscles, and it provides a force of propulsion in many of the species that are aquatic. So if we take a look at this basic tree, we can see that the root, of course, would represent those that are chordates. Remember, the deuterostomes also include the echinodermata, which would be the first branch. However, of all of the chordates, the most basal group would be the cephalochordata. So it's the cephalochordata that had evolved first, and then the urochord. So a common name for the cephalochordata is the lancelets. There's an example of a lancelet shown in this image. The brachiostoma. Key characteristics of lancelets include the blade-like shape. So it's very similar to the lancet. So they're basically named after the lancet, the blood lancet that's used to obtain blood from humans. It's a very sharp object. So it's got a blade-like shapes, and it is a marine organism, and it feeds by suspension. As you note, and as I mentioned before, this is one of those examples in which the adult body retains all of the characteristics of a typical chordate body plan. So the notochord is retained, the pharyngeal slits are not converted to any other structures. The dorsal hollow nerve cord remains as the dorsal hollow nerve cord, and nothing develops into vertebrae, of course, because this is a chordate, and it has the post. The other basal group, which is the next to evolve, called the urochordata. Urochordata include the tunicates. These are going to be more closely related to the other chordates than the lancelets, as shown in the tree. So these most resemble the chordates during their larval stage. So you can see the larval stage, they have the chordate body plan, the notochord, the postanal tail, the dorsal hollow nerve cord, the pharynx with slits, so pharyngeal slits. They also have an in-current and ex-current siphon, which allows the suspension feeding to occur. So this is how it draws in the water and filters the food particles. These are much more highly derived, and they have less Hox genes than other vertebrates. However, they do, as they grow up into an adult stage, they do not retain the chordate body plan as previously described. So the in-current and ex-current siphon is still present, just the overall body plan begins to change. And you can see development of an intestine and stomach, a full digestive system. So you can see it becomes a little bit larger. And what's key here is the reason why they're called the tunicates is because of the presence of a tunic, which is really a tissue that surrounds the body. If we look at early chordate evolution, the ancestral chordates may have resembled lancelets, and this is really what the characteristics of the lancelets and the nerve cord within the lancelets suggest that the lancelets are those the basal group. So in the lancelets, the Hox genes that organize the brain are expressed in the tip of the nerve cord. And these are very similar to the Hox genes that organize the vertebrate brain. Of course, the vertebrates evolved much later. So here we're talking about early chordates and the evolution of chordates all the way through to vertebrates. So if we look at this comparison, we have a vertebrate embryo, and we can see these two genes, BF1 and OXT, up in the tip of the nerve column or nerve cord of a vertebrate, and also in the tip of the nerve cord of the lancelet embryo. So upon sequencing of the tunicate genome, this suggests that the genes associated with the heart and the thyroid are very common to all chordates, and also the genes that are associated with the transmission of nerve impulses. These are actually unique to vertebrates, which makes vertebrates a little more evolved than both the tunicate and the lancelet. So these evidences suggest that the lancelets and the tunicates considered chordates. However, they are basically the evolution and the steps to the vertebrate. So let's take a little reminder of what we just talked about, and we're going to be moving into the chordates in the next few segments. So, as I mentioned, we have the ancestral deuterostome. The echinodermata were discussed in chapter 33. However, we're bringing it to this chapter since they are deuterostomes. And then this segment really focused on the characteristics of chordates. One of those characteristics is the presence of a notochord at some point during their development. However, the cephalochordata retain the notochord, the urochordata do not, but both of them are considered chordates. However, they are not vertebrates because they have no vertebrae. The next few segments, we will look at the groups of vertebrates, which include many other subgroups.